Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the fourth installment of our discussion in this week, and that is on textiles and contemporary arts in India. So we have already covered some of the areas that we were supposed to sort of go through in this week, and that is to do with like the various approaches through which we see textile is either incorporated in the contemporary art practices or how textile becomes part of the artistic expression by the contemporary Indian artists today. Also, we have looked into the role of textile in performance art, and being performance art as this one particular area of contemporary art that we see that has developed in the late 20th century, and still now it has been sort of experimented with. So today we'll be talking more about Nilima Sheikh and Shruti Mahajan, these two artists who have been using the language of textile, also different kind of textile metaphors, and perhaps different references from textile into their practice. Sometimes they are actually made into textile, but mostly we see that the works are done either on paper or on canvas and with pigments and everything else, but then that would reflect how textile is incorporated. So perhaps some of the ideas around textile, but then it is sort of stretched beyond the materiality of textile and textile making in this context. So we'll start the discussion with Nilima Sheikh's this textile like scrolls. So on screen we have certain display, certain scrolls on display, and that comes from this one particular set that is called Each Night Put Kashmir in Your Dreams. And this entire set, this set of this 9 panels were made by Nilima Sheikh from 2003 to 2014, and during this time we find that Nilima Sheikh had engaged with different kind of narratives. So for example, we find the different kind of folk tales, journalistic stories, at the same time mythical stories, and then also experiential aspect, memories, historical narratives. All these different kind of stories are put together in these panels, and these works are also sort of shaped by or informed by Agha Shahid Ali's poetry. So this is something we find that how this idea about displacement, how this idea about land and the people who are displaced from the land, and then how they sort of reclaim certain part of their history, memory, or how those part of memories are sort of recollected or perhaps relieved. So those ideas we find them to be there in this set of works by Nilima Sheikh. Now if we see the kind of display that Nilima Sheikh opted for, and this is where we find the textile like form that came into prevalence. So we see this large panels which are made on, sometimes they are done on canvas, sometimes they are done on this Worsely paper, and then of course in the tempera process in which pigment colors are used, the colors are processed and then they are used on these panels. So in this case we see that the kind of hanging that she opted for, it's not really on the wall like the paintings would be usually displayed, but they are usually suspended from the ceiling to the floor, almost like the way in which we see the carpets are hung. Or sometimes we can also compare it to the painted scrolls, the way they are displayed. Now the one issue we can find in terms of the painted scrolls, that the painted scrolls, if we think about its traditional way of displaying, that way it will be the painted scrolls are rolled and unrolled when a narrative is spoken about or a narrative is depicted, and then it's not really always that the entire scroll will be displayed all at once. So in that case we see that this kind of display strategy might not always seem like a painted scroll, even though we find that Nilima Sheikh had spoken about how she had taken references from painted scrolls, not only from India but also from Eastern Asia, from China, from Japan, and so on. So in those respects we can find that the textile like hanging, this idea of the hanging is very much ingrained in the way she wanted the works to be interacting with the viewers. So if the works are stuck to the wall, if we think about it, then there is the way of viewership is sort of restricted, that if someone stands at one particular point and they can only see the work on the wall from one particular way of looking through that. And when it comes in terms of like this kind of display in which the work is displayed in the center or not really close to the walls, then it gives the flexibility to the viewers to walk around the walls, and that is how the interaction between the viewers and the work is also heightened, and there are new ways of seeing or new ways of experiencing the work is also introduced. So something we can find that the flexibility that this works also sort of embed into them is something we can also relate that to the way like curtains or hangings, the textile hangings are displayed. So that is how we find that there are many ways in which Nilima Sheikh's works actually sort of go back to the textile like forms in its practice. Now if we relate it back to Nilima Sheikh's background, that she had studied in this Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda, and as I have already mentioned that school has been prolific in terms of producing a number of successful Indian contemporary artists, and Nilima Sheikh did her studies there, and then in the 1980s that we find that she was involved in a few different kind of activities which also allowed her to shape her practice in a particular manner. So in the right side of the screen, so if we see that how Nilima Sheikh's practice sort of, when we see this textile like scrolls, those are hanging on the from the ceiling to the floor, and if we see this kind of practices, then what are the roots for them? So if we sort of go back in time and see how Nilima Sheikh's practice had developed over time, perhaps some of the traces we can find in the 1980s. So Nilima Sheikh had studied in this Maharaja Sayajirao University in Baroda at the school which I have already mentioned to be highly significant in terms of producing a number of contemporary Indian artists. So Nilima Sheikh had studied there, and later on we find that she had her interest in pigment making, miniature paintings and many other forms of traditional Indian paintings. From there we find that in the 1980s she received a fellowship from the Government of India, and for her own interest she went out to Nathdwara and parts of Rajasthan to study certain kind of practices, and one of them was definitely the Pichwai making practice. So Pichwai, for we see that here Nilima Sheikh had done this drawing, and this comes from 1980s after her studies, after her research on the Pichwais, in which we see that she had captured the essential compositional elements in a Pichwai, and the Pichwais are mostly at the cloth which are hung in the back of the deities, or sometimes when the deities are not present in form of an idol or an icon, then the Pichwais are displayed for the devotees to appreciate or continue the veneration of the deities. So the Pichwais in Nathdwara, we find them to be specifically made for Srinathji or the Vaishnavite deities, and in this case we see that here there is this place that is reserved for this form of Krishna who is playing the flute, and then the other forms of landscape we find it to be there, in which here we see a depiction of Ras Leela here as well, and then there is this forest landscape that is situated here, and in the foreground we find there is this again there is suggestion of buildings and architecture that to sort of mark this area differently from this forest landscape. Now on the top of this panel we find there is this prominent moon which also marks this full moon night of Ras, and then we also have the deities who are represented in this on these vimanas, who are floating in the sky and perhaps evidencing this divine act of Lord Krishna. So when we see this, that we see that Nilima Sheikh was interested in this kind of textile hangings. So Pichwais are made on cotton fabric, and then on the top of that pigment color is used on textile for drawing them, and since they are used as hanging and not really something that would be stuck to the wall, so that's the reason the flow of this kind of textiles and the utility of this kind of textiles are something that we find that Nilima Sheikh had studied from very early times. In the 1980s, in the left image that we have, it's a photograph by Nilima Sheikh, and in this one we find that she had photographed theatre production at the Kasoli Arts Center in 1989, and Kasoli Arts Center was also a very significant art center where we find a number of artists from India were involved, like Vivan Sundaram, Geeta Kapoor, art historian, and then many of the artists today we find, including Alex Matthew and many other people, all of them, they have been at the Kasoli Art Center for residency programs and so on. And Nilima Sheikh is also someone we find her to be there in the Kasoli Art Center. And as part of this art activities, we find that she was also someone who was invested in the theatrical productions. So the theatricality, the use of costume, the use of textile and everything else is also something we find that to be sort of incorporated when she does her own paintings. Now this idea about the hanging, about the Pichwai hanging is something is significant, because when we see this kind of hangings here, we find that from 1980s, as she started studying the Pichwai hangings in Rajasthan, the study was perhaps not limited to only this area, but then the idea was also expanded. We also find that this kind of hangings can also be related to particular kind of thankas which are displayed in the Himalayan region. And since this work is about the memories and histories of Kashmir, we find that some of the Buddhist tankas which are found in the Himalayan monasteries, the Buddhist monasteries, are something that is almost like brought back into the gallery sphere, and how the tankas are displayed during particular occasions as part of a performance or part of carrying out a particular activity is also sort of enlivened when this narratives by Nilima Sheikh are sort of brought to life through her paintings. So this way we find that it's not just the textile hanging that she sort of studied and incorporated in her works, but it is also the performance aspect of it, or the theatricality of it. And that is the reason we find that how her works are something that needs to be seen from different viewpoints, and it's not just from one strict viewpoint that the works need to be seen and appreciated. So in all those ways we find that her research on the textiles and pigments, and of course how this kind of theatrical performance, her interest in them, all of them, they are amalgamated in the complex work she does. And her works, we find that it also sort of responds to the minute characters of materials. So she had spoken in depth about the different kind of pigments she uses, the places from which she collects the pigments, but then she has also spoken about paper in depth, that from 1980s when she started her work, she had explored different kind of handmade papers, and also the khadi papers that we find that how she had sort of brought in. And the khadi is something we have already discussed in the earlier modules, how khadi has been significant in terms of the production of this anti-colonial fabric in India, and then how the rugs and the waste of the fabric and everything else, and then also using of the indigenous method of making paper is something, all of those activities are brought together in the khadi production units. So Nilima Sheikh had looked minutely into the characters of this khadi papers as well, and then also the different kind of husk papers like rice husk paper, bamboo husk paper, and so on, making of the wasli paper which was prevalent in making the miniature paintings, but then ultimately displaying them as those textile hangings. Now when we go back to this particular textile, this textile also sort of makes many kind of meanderings. So in one hand we can see those vertical strips which are sort of flowing in those panels, but at the same time we also have how there are lines, there are forms, and then there are also elements which interweave through all those vertical panels, and that is how we find there is a embedded idea of a map Since like this works are about Kashmir, we find that the idea of a map or the landscape is also something that is very much embedded in these works. Now if we sort of think about the map and Kashmir, we cannot deny its sort of reference to the map shawl that we have already studied as part of our study material in the week of looking at the embroidered narratives. So we see how this map shawls or like different other kind of embroidered shawls, the way they are displayed, and I have also specifically mentioned that how this map shawl was perhaps not meant to be worn by people, but it was meant for a gift or for displaying. So this aspect of a shawl being displayed, the presence of a map, and then how this map, shawl and landscape, all of them come together in that particular object, is something we can also see that to be reflected in Nilima Sheikh's exploration as well. And this exploration we cannot really consider as coincidental, because definitely that Nilima Sheikh had minutely studied these different aspects of material culture from Kashmir and deliberately incorporated them as part of her own explorations here. Now we see that there is another reference to textile that also comes up strongly in Nilima Sheikh's work, and that is to encompass an entire space. So if we see this area, and this is a display that is called Terrain, this comes from this exhibition that is called Terrain, Carrying a Cross Leaving Behind, and that took place in 2017 at the Kemol Art Gallery, Mumbai. And here we find this octagonal space is created by arranging these panels, again this hanging like panels in a particular manner, and in this case we find that they operate almost as screens. The screens we see that becomes almost part of an interior architectural form, and then it sort of encompasses the viewer, but it also sort of like shelters someone or guards someone. So we see that the screens, either they are made from textile or bamboo or something else, the way they are used in the interior settings, we see that this is about perhaps guarding a particular space from the other sides, and this idea we find that to be also incorporated in Nilima Sheikh's exploration, in which we see in this particular set of work, in this 8 panels, Nilima Sheikh had looked into certain kind of narratives around, again, folk tales and issues around gender, and then of course that the kind of atrocities that happen against women, and then of course that there are many shared narratives that we find they are also made part of these panels. So Nilima Sheikh not only paints on these panels but also uses text extensively. So it kind of reminds us of those manuscript paintings or the miniature paintings in which text and images they come together simultaneously, but then the way they are displayed, then again that goes back to either furnishing or the textile panels that we use. So this is the kind of overlapping, or this is the kind of in-betweenness that we find in Nilima Sheikh's practice, and in there we also see that how the colors, or perhaps also like this idea of the tent as something that encompasses us, is also something that has its root in her exposure to the theatrical productions. In the 1990s, we also find that she had experimented with her display strategy, in which tent-like forms were erected and then her works were displayed in that premise. So here we find that even though there is nothing that covers the top of this particular work, but then the way it sort of like takes the viewer into its fold is a way again that reminds us about the presence of tents, a strong presence of tents. So this is how we find that how the textile metaphors are sort of brought in, different kind of references about textiles are brought in Nilima Sheikh's work for not only just the thematic exploration but also for the interactivity of these works. For Shruti Mahajan, what we find that a textile architecture, and of course that the way textiles are made, all those ideas they come together. And Shruti Mahajan is an artist, is a contemporary artist who had studied both in this Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda and also the National School of Design from so for that reason what we see that she had absorbed the knowledge of both these areas. In one hand we find this so-called fine art institution, and in the other hand we find this design institution. And as I have mentioned earlier, that these distinctions, at least in the field of academic experience, were pronounced by the kind of curriculum those are sort of propagated and sort of continued in these institutions, and also the kind of training which were provided to the students in these institutions. But then for Shruti Mahajan, what happens that she had studied in both these institutions, and that's the reason we find that her approach towards utilizing textile, her approach towards looking at architecture or looking at art making, all these things are kind of again in between. That of course she produces works which meant to be displayed in the gallery space, in the sphere of contemporary art, but then we cannot really consider it that it does not acknowledge that the utilitarian aspects of textile making or the architectural forms that we study. So both these aspects we find that to be there in a much more synchronized way in Shruti Mahajan's practice. Now, among her many different sets of work that she has been producing for years, this particular two works that I wanted to discuss here is one is called Bracket, and these are very recent set of her drawings. We find that it is her revisit of the Ahilya Fort in Maheshwar in Madhya Pradesh. So during her studies, she had stayed in the Ahilyawada in Maheshwar, in the fort there during her internship, during her studies, and then she had closely observed this interrelation between the architecture of the vara, where the brackets there which sort of support the roof, but also the same time how these bracket structures, this wooden bracket structures are something we can also relate to the loom structures. And Maheshwar is also known as a fine center of weaving, silk weaving. So for that reason we find that how this structure of the bracket is something that comes between the bar and the column. So the bracket sort of connects these two elements, one is horizontal and one is vertical, and the bracket is something that is diagonal, and that sort of makes the connection between these two aspects. So that's the reason we find that when she sort of focuses on bracket, it's not just an architectural element that she looks at, but she also closely thinks about that how this is a joinery, and that can be related to the loom structures which are very much prevalent there in the Ahilya Fort, in the same premise where weavers also function, and the silk weaving continues there. So in one hand we find that the architecture, weaving, all those things are connected there through these brackets, and then on the other hand we find that her exposure to the steps, the ghat which goes to the river Narmada, is also something that is reflected in her exploration of this interrelation between architecture and loom structure and everything else. Now, this discussion also brings us back to our initial discussion on the relationship between architecture and textile, which came up in Zemper's theorization, and perhaps this is a concluding part for our discussion here, when we find that how in the artistic interventions this kind of interrelation between architecture, textile and loom structure is something that is coming up again and again. In this work that was again, it was displayed in 2021, and it was part of this exhibition project which is called Spatial Dialogues, and in which we find that it was a collaborative project between Shruti Mahajan and Ravindra Gundu Rao, and both of them, Ravindra Gundu Rao is a architectural conservation architect, and we find that how certain kind of architectural patterns that we see, certain kind of lines or the stripes that we observe when the steps of the vara is sort of observed, then certain kind of waves that one observes in the river. So all those lines, all those stripes are then closely sort of studied, and then they are communicated to the weavers in the site, and this is how this set of textiles were developed. We see this set of diaphanous textiles now here. These are on display in the Shrine Empire Gallery of New Delhi, and here we find that how this in these textiles there are those stripe lines, and instead of making them in the regular interval, we find that the interval between different kind of stripes are being experimented with. Something where we find that the distance between the lines, the density between different kinds of lines, the depth and everything that changes, perhaps it's a way of passing of time, or also like we see how the waves they change. Also we see that how the steps are there, and then there is a landing, again there are steps. So in this ways in which we see how the collaboration actually took place, that the conservation architect, their knowledge about architecture, and then Shruti Mahajan's long standing study of this particular site and being rooted in Maheshwar, and then of course her communication and collaboration with the weavers on site, all of those issues they come up closely in this exploration of this textile, this set of textiles which were produced and they were displayed. So this is how we find that how architecture, loom mechanism, making of woven textile, all those things they come together in Shruti Mahajan's work, whereas in Nilima Sheikh's work we find that how the textile metaphors, different kind of references of the textile, they come together, and by this we find in both cases how the idea of textile is something that has been expanded beyond its material limitation, but then the idea of textile, its relationship to text, architecture and our experiences are something that is celebrated in this two artists' work. Thank you.